Welcome, family. This is Jeremy and Mensa with a Shot of E&J podcast. I'm with my co-host,
Eric Igwe.
And we got a wonderful episode planned for you today. We're going to talk about climate change.
Yes.
But first, we want to get into our top headlines.
Yes. And we'll also have with us Dr. Omar Harvey from TCU,
yes.
PhD in geology. He's going to share some wisdom insight to climate change. How are you doing, Dr. Harvey?
I'm doing great. Great to be here.
Thank you.
Great to talk about an important topic.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes. Now, of course, before we do that, we're going to go doing our headlines. So, Jim, what you got as a topic?
So, I think student loan forgiveness has been a big deal. I know for me personally, has been a big deal going to law school and the debt that you accumulate. And even for those who are, an undergrad as well, a lot of people have debt coming out of undergrad. Mm-hmm. It's been controversial. A lot of people feel like, hey, you know what? I was able to make my student loan payments, pay off my loans, so why should others be forgiven debt? So it's one of those things that is very interesting. I think the program is fair. It looks like, a decent amount was forgiven up to what the Biden administration thought that statutorily they could actually do. Mm-hmm. Yet again, it's one of those things. It's controversial. So, what are your thoughts on it?
I mean, and just for those who don't know, it's President Biden using existing acts, uses his power to go ahead and waive student loans. We know that student loan interest and payments have been paused for going back to I think 2020 under President Trump, and then President Biden continued that, and then a lot of people have been anxiously waiting for the moment of would there be some form of student loan forgiveness. Biden had part of his campaign promised $10,000, and then he a week or two ago he made the announcement to go and waive up to $20,000 if you have a Pell Grant, and this is for people who are making up to $125,000 if you're a single person, or up to $250,000 if you're married or head of household. So you get $10,000. Waived off federally, not private. I got private; it don't apply to me. But federally, you get $10,000 waived off if you make under $125,000 as a single person, or $250,000 as a married couple or head of household. And so and like I said, you get additional $10,000 if you ever received a Pell Grant before. So I think it's great news. I know there's some people. Me, naturally, I wanted more, at least up to $50,000. Because I think it's a good case to wipe it out, to do a wipeout and really give a clean break for people. But I'm going to still celebrate the fact that he did this. I think it says going to get rid of like a third of all federal student loan borrows. So I think this is great. I'm looking forward to the rollout of the application form to come out in October. The White House or the administration may end up waiving certain people's student loans automatically get waived without them filling out the application because they already have their income data.
Yeah.
But others are going to have to fill out the application. I think they're expecting to provide that data for the instructions on for people to apply for this opportunity in October. I think I read in the reports. But I'm excited overall. But I think it doesn't completely address everything. You can do student loan forgiveness, but unless you do how to deal with rising costs for tuition at universities, then it's almost repeating the same pattern again. So I'm hoping there's going to be steps that the Congress takes, the administration takes, to help address tuition costs across the different universities nationwide. Dr. Harvey, any?
Yeah, for me, I think I agree with you guys. It's a great thing. I am a Martin Luther kind of guy, so I think this is putting shoes on so you could then pull up your own self by your bootstraps.
Yeah.
So I think this is a great effort, particularly for young people, to start from a less negative number. Too much of a negative is never good. And so I see this as a great opportunity.
Absolutely. And I guess another topic to bring is start of college football. So college football has already started.
Yeah.
This past Thursday.
This was Michigan State played Western Michigan.
Yeah, I was trying to. Yeah,
and Notre Dame was playing.
I was trying to remember who played, but I know it's starting up this week. I'm a Longhorns fan, so naturally hook 'em. We'll see how far we go. I know Jeremy, same thing for you. What you thinking?
Yeah. We gotta support our our undergraduate institution. They've had some struggles recently, obviously.
Yep.
So we'll see what they do. And then I think just in general, the college landscape is really changing with the SEC really kind of just taking over.
Yep.
So it'll be interesting. It'll be an interesting season. Dr. Harvey, we know
TCU all day.
No, I'm actually an Aggie.
Oh,
I'm an Aggie.
So,
I work at TCU. I love both schools.
Yes.
My heart is in College Station. Don't say that.
Got you. You got to show a little love there.
So that's a good thing. Eventually when Texas moves to the SEC, then we'll maybe bring back that Aggie Longhorn rivalry. So that that's what college football I feel like is about. Those rivalry games are big. So looking forward to it. Looking forward to that.
Yes.
So our next headline is the Jackson, Mississippi water crisis. And, it's very interesting. What are you guys' thoughts on that?
So, I mean, and like I said, for those who don't know, I think they're entering a 6th day of where they have a plant that's failed to able to produce clean water. So you got thousands of residents getting affected because they're not able to access clean water. You've had a situation where you had a flood, I think, that essentially contaminated or affected the plant there. And now there's some chemical imbalance. Now the plant's not able to produce that clean water people need. And so they were even on a boiling water notice, right? They had to boil water at some point. And so now they're entering a 6th day where thousands of residents are not able to access clean water. It is truly a disaster. It's so unfortunate to hear what's happening there. And I know I'm definitely hoping that they're getting the relief they need. I'm hoping that this can get resolved, really quickly and get to the bottom of what's going on. And I'm hoping that, like I said, federally they're getting the relief they have. It's just unfortunate, like I said, in this age that people still struggling to get that access to clean water. And I know there's a more investigation underway to get full detail on what's going on. Dr. Harvey, any?
Yeah, I as I was mentioning to you guys earlier, fairly familiar with that region, area. I spent 3 years as a professor before I came to TCU at University of Southern Miss. Great people, very resilient people out there. I think this also ties into the greater topic of climate change, right? This flood event after a long drought, right? How does climate plays into that? And I think it's one of the things we have to consider when we talk about climate change. How do we frame it, right? The impacts on people who are typically underrepresented or I guess marginalized, right? Who don't have the economics to keep an upgraded water treatment plant or something like that. That's what kind of environmental justice that exists for them to make sure that these things don't happen. So I think it's in the bigger realm of climate change and so forth. We'll talk about that in greater details as we go through.
Yeah. All right.
And hopefully shed some light on that, man.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Water is important.
No, exactly. It is absolutely essential. We're looking forward to hearing that. And that concludes our top headlines. So when we come back, we look forward to we're going to go a deep dive into climate change, climate change 101, we want to call it. And we'll have Dr. Omar Harvey, who's going to provide great insight. And looking forward to this to be a good educational, enlightening experience. So come back with us on the Shot of E&J podcast. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Shot of E&J podcast. This is your host, co-host Eric Igwe,
Chairman Adamensa,
and we have our special guest, Dr. Omar Harvey. PhD professor at TCU with PhD in geology. Dr. Omar Harvey, thank you again for joining us. Can you give an introduction, a background for everyone?
Yes. So originally I'm from Jamaica. I was born and raised in Jamaica. I came here about 22 years ago. I attended school in Virginia Tech. Then I did grad work at the University of Florida. And I finished my PhD at Texas A&M. Then I moved to Washington State to actually do some work on geologic carbon sequestration. So one of the strategies for climate change. By training, I am a geochemist, right? So I look on things related to energy and energy dynamics and chemical dynamics. Basically how those two collide and impact the environment or impact changes in the environment. I'm married to my high school sweetheart. We just celebrated 20 years of marriage, really 26 together. So she makes everything happen. We have 3 little planet shakers. We have 3 kids that are great, 2 boys and a girl. Right, and as you mentioned, I am now a professor at TCU in the Department of Geological Sciences. So, yeah, and this is a topic that's dear to my heart. Yeah, and not only as it pertains to the current arguments around climate change, but the bigger picture. Right, I think that's in I guess sensitizing things or talking about things in a sensational way, we miss the picture. Right? Yes. We miss why this is important, and so that's where I see my role here is to sort of integrate things, right? Bring an integral view to everything. Okay,
that's great.
Yeah.
So, and again, we really thank you for coming here. It's a pleasure to have an expert on climate change. But how would you define it? What is it for those out there that are, sort of new to the topic? I mean, we should know, right? But I think it's good to give sort of like a background on climate change and what that is and what that entails.
Yeah. So when we actually talk about climate, it's not weather. People often, so climate is long-term trends. What are the trends that we're seeing over long term? And what we're seeing is that the actual trends that we're expecting naturally, right? So it's different than what we have seen over long term, right? So geologists are particularly experts at studying things over long term, right? And so we could go back to ice core data, we could go back to rocks, we could look at all different things to then reconstruct what the environment looked like back then, and then tie it to what the atmosphere actually looked like. So climate change is basically based on long-term trends that we have been observing. It's different than what's typically expected. And in particularly now, there's something that we call the Great Acceleration, which is 1950 practically. That's where things have been accelerated. It's faster than what anything we have ever seen. Wow. It's not that we have seen higher amounts of CO2 in the environment. The primary focus is around CO2. But the thing is, it wasn't driven by our activity. We weren't around those times. And so the consequences are going to be different, like things like droughts, and when you get long dry periods and then there's a lot of rainfall, you get flooding. Events like what happened in Mississippi, what happened out in St. Louis, all those kind of things, right? So that's what climate change actually is about. I don't know if that's wrong. So it's long-term changes that we usually observe, and now we're observing different than what those trends suggest, right?
Do you feel like it's a result of human activity that drives it?
As it pertains to the current one, absolutely. Okay. There's no doubt about that. I mean, I do an exercise in my classes to show students that it's if you do what we call a carbon cycle, right, and you actually do the balance, you realize that natural processes release the same as it takes out. So it's net zero. Yeah. But if you then now include the imbalance that we currently see, it's coming from one primary source. Burning fossil fuel. I don't know of any other animals except ourselves that burns fossil fuels. So now it becomes very tedious in assigning blame, right? You don't like to take blame, I don't like to take blame. And I think that's where it is.
So help us with the science of it, just at the most, I guess, generic level, because I know, and I'm not an expert, but I know there's the case where like, hey, you burning fossil fuels, right? And those emissions rise up to the ozone layer. The gases get trapped.
Gets trapped in the atmosphere. Right? So essentially, have you ever been in a greenhouse? Greenhouse where they plant plants?
No, I've seen,
I've seen
images.
Right. So if you go into one of those, it's usually way hotter inside than outside. Right. And it's similar to what's happening here. So the planet in the atmosphere is protected by some gases, a series of gases, right? CO2, methane, all the gases. It's actually a protective blanket. Right. And so it prevents when the sun comes in, right, there's some that radiates back to space. Right. And it's that actually makes Earth livable. Right. And so if you have an imbalance in the amount of those gases, you can create a colder environment or a warmer environment. CO2 is one of those greenhouse gases that cause warming. And so when you burn more fossil fuels or carbon in general, it's not only fossil fuel. The way I explain it to my students, it's really an imbalance between photosynthesis and respiration that we have always learned, right? Yeah. Photosynthesis removes CO2 from the atmosphere. Respiration puts it back into the atmosphere. If you have more going out than being removed, right, then you create a higher amount of the CO2 or gases that would warm.
Gotcha.
Right? And so the amount of heat that usually escapes back to space doesn't escape anymore. So it stays on Earth. And that's what used to be global warming.
Yeah,
now they change it to climate change. I think the next phase should be environmental change, because then that has consequences that far outweighs just talking about climate and CO2 in the environment. So that's essentially that.
Gotcha.
Right. So it's an imbalance.
Gotcha. Right. So what kind of precipitated the change in naming to go from global warming to climate change? Did they think that climate change was better for the public to understand, or what? I'm just curious.
It's limits, right? If I say it's global warming, you think that it's only warming.
Yeah.
Right. It's just, but that shifts things at other places. So it could be cooling. Yeah. Right. Your winters could get colder. And I don't know if you remember this, but a few years back, there was some senator that went in, I think it was in Congress, and it was snowing outside, and he took up this amount of snow, and he was in Congress, and he lifted up and see, we're talking about global warming. We should be talking about global cooling. Well, that just gives you some idea of what the knowledge base is. Yeah. So I think it expands, and that's why I'm saying the next one should be environmental change. Yeah. I think climate change evokes a certain reaction in people.
Yeah.
Right? That's the natural thing. Oh, my climate is changing. I'm getting hotter. But it's things like what we just saw this summer. Is it going to be more frequent? Where we didn't get, I've lived in Fort Worth for 7 years now, and it's the longest time we haven't gotten rain.
Yeah, right? I was stunned. Was it almost a month?
It was very long. And then this is far more 100-degree days than I have seen behind each other. Yeah. So the big thing here is really how much more often are we going to see this? Yeah. Right? And then there's consequences that then cascade from that. What about your crops? Right? The crops that feed us. Yeah. Right? I work with urban farmers on the southeast side of town. A lot of them are planning to shrink their farms. Because they don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah, the yields are going to be far less.
And so help us more. So the emissions and gases get trapped. The ozone layer gets affected. It can lead to a warming, or it can lead to certain. That impact can lead to parts of the earth getting extreme heat, or it can just cultivate and lead to like extreme weather in certain places. Like certain parts of Earth. All
right. So the way I like to put it to my students, that Earth is a system. Get that fundamentally correct, right? And that's why I think geologists in particular, which is a field that we don't teach enough, right? is that I think it's that one science that views Earth as a system. So get that first.
Okay.
Earth is a system. So if Earth is a system, if you shift something in one part, think of your body or your circulatory system or whatever, if something happens in one side of it, it's going to cascade and it's going to affect all the others, right? So in this case, if we're burning more fossil fuels, right, a simple example is this. You burn more fossil fuel, it rises, it prevents the sun rays that usually go back out to space, right? It prevents them from going back out, so it stays on Earth. Well, that creates more warming, right? If you have warming in, say, where there's a lot of ice, that ice is going to melt, right? Then that ice is going to run down to the ocean, right? It's going to cause the ocean level to rise. Most of us wants to live close to the water. But that's going to cause flooding. And then there's a cascade of implications for that. A lot of people may not think even of this, like in California, right? If we have this warming, and that's how California actually gets most of its water is from the mountains. When you have the snowfall, it stays up there. Then in spring, it melts, it's run down, and then it's channeled over to California in the west. Well, if you have less snowfall, right, and you have it melting much faster, then it impacts how the water is. So it's a lot. So if you think of it as a system, that's the real thing.
I got you.
I mean, it takes a lot to really think of it in that sense, but that's the way I would encourage people to think of it.
I see. The question was asked, so what's the best way for scientists, experts, to convince non-believers that, hey, climate change or environmental change is not a result of nature? Because some will say, oh, it's nature, it's not human action, lies. It's just nature. That's what happens. This droughts before. I admit sometimes initially, years ago, I was like, I didn't fully understand it. Now I felt like, in my opinion, there was not maybe enough scientists who broke it down in a way that able to get people to get the correlation right. But how do you still convince? And I understand it now. But how do you get those non-believers to recognize that said, hey, it's not just something natural. Like human action is directly causing these extreme conditions.
So the way I like to put it, right, and I said this earlier, there is for the ones they consider to be deniers. I don't consider them deniers. I think it's if you don't have all the information, or you refuse to see all the information, right, or it wasn't broken down to you in a way that you could understand, right, then you may be seen as a denier. But the way I see it, right, is in this sense, right? There is evidence, as I said, that CO2 levels were far higher than now, right? But we weren't present, right? There was so whatever happens then, whatever was driving it, probably volcanic activity or whatever. But there's evidence for that. We can't deny that. There's evidence in the records for that. The challenge is we weren't around then, so the consequences that we're likely to face never existed then. So this is what I was saying. If we don't link events to consequences, because consequences is what make people move, right? If you have an investment and you're going to lose it or have a potential, that will let you move. But if you don't make that connection, it's like you're free to deny all you want. So I would say it's often, and scientists are terrible at this. I am terrible at this, right? Conveying message to the public in a way that they could understand it. And I think that's part of it too. And then there are people who are invested or all their investment are in this particular area that is being blamed. Right? So how do you justify I'm going to lose my millions or I'm going to lose all of that, right? So I think it's far more, I'm not sure they're deniers, but I think it's that I'm not sure how to convince people without consequences. I think it's consequences that really matter.
I got you. I like the connection to consequences because, like I said, when it's tangible and says, okay, this action, if I keep up, then I'm seeing, things drying up, and I'm seeing my grass is getting affected. I see my crops getting affected. If, like you said, in agriculture, I hear more stories where like they got to get rid of some of the pasture. They got to get rid of some of the cows. They got to do some of these farmers have to do extreme things because of the effects of climate change. And so if people start knowing that, hey, your crops, the stuff you made, the food products that these farmers make are about to be cut in half, which means it's going to raise your prices up.
Yes.
Because we're not dealing with these ways to prevent climate change. And I think, like you're saying, tying to those events, I think that's the way to go. And I want to. That's one of the things I want to continue to see more of is that those connections. I remember watching. I don't remember the name of the documentary, but it's Al Gore's. I think it's called Inconvenient Truth.
Inconvenient Truth.
I watched, and I think that was a good way for me to get a great understanding of the effects of climate change. And I know it's definitely have awards or a lot of recognition, but having that connection to consequence, like you said, I think it will be the way to go.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I think the consequences thing is huge because, too, what we see, especially on the socioeconomic side, is that some people feel like, hey, I'm not being affected. And they are just unaware of how this actually affects us all, So some of the effects, with the food supply and stuff like that, some people may be insulated from it to a degree, but eventually over time, which is, the whole deal with climate change, right? We're looking at these trends over time. They are definitely going to be affected. And I think it's important, for us to stress that, you know what I'm saying, to the public so that they have that. Along those lines, what can the public do in order to prevent climate change? There's been a lot about different ways to try to conserve energy and do things like that. But what are the things that you would recommend for the public to do to really have that impact today?
I think it's a layered approach, right? I think oftentimes we go with the big gun to the war first. I think that's good, right? So there are big engineering efforts to directly take the CO2 out of the atmosphere. That's fantastic. That's great. I think on a more local level, it's the little things you do. It's the balances, right? For instance, eating local. Right. So if you consume food that is local, you're reducing transportation. You're reducing that cost. You're reducing the amount of fuel used. All that, right? You're looking at things like food waste diversion. We're actually working on a project with the farmers over there. If you think of for instance, Fort Worth, growing Fort Worth, right? Fort Worth is growing exponentially. I use the example that when I moved there in 2015, I live on the southwest side of town. I was on the edge of the development. Now I'm in the middle. Right? So how do we then address those things is important, right? What that then means is that we have to start thinking of activities that keep our carbon. So that generates a lot of food waste. If you've ever been to any event, there's a lot of waste. Where does that waste go to? The landfill. Right? What happens to it in the landfill? Right? It converts to methane. Methane actually is one of those greenhouse gases that are far more potent than CO2. Right? So right? So one of the efforts that we have been working on, particularly with those East Fort Worth urban farmers, is we say to the city, divert the food waste out to the farmers. They compost it. They land apply it. Right? Then that now starts producing food. That carbon doesn't go to the landfill to take up space, so you're saving space, right? That carbon also is sequestered in the soil. A lot of people don't know this, but the soil is the only net zero system that is naturally on Earth.
Wow.
The soil releases just the same amount that it takes in, right? And so that's one benefit. You're diverting waste, right? you're using that waste, which is nutrient rich, to then grow new crops. That carbon is sequestered in the soil or locked away in the soil, so it doesn't go to form CO2 or anything, or a fraction of it, right? So it's really a balance. It's stuff like that. There's other technological things that you could do, like creating more efficient solar cells. As simple as that, right? So as of now, it's like 20, at best, a solar cell is 25% efficient, at best. If you could get that up to 50, right, then that means you need half as many cells, which means you need half as many resources to make those, right? Which then comes from fossil fuel, believe it or not. There's no such thing as green energy without fossil fuels, right? So it's a plethora of things that we could do, right? We conserve on our energy, which means there's less demand on the fuel. So we could even conserve on our water, right? Because those water treatment plant has to be run on fuels, right? Yeah. So that's why I was saying it's more focused on, it should be focused on environmental change and the integration of this as a system. Right? I think when we talk about it as climate change, people are really separated, but it affects every part of your life, right? Yeah. And the solution is there.
Yeah, that's great. That is great. And I'm looking for, when we come back from our break, we're going to dive in more into your experience. So we're looking forward to hearing your experience, especially about carbon sequestration. We'll dive in more into that and those technological advances that can be taken to really reduce climate change, among other things, and talk about how the roles that elected officials can play. So this is great. So when we come back on a Shot E&J podcast, you'll get to hear more from Dr. Omar Harvey from Texas Christian University. See you back from a break.
All right, welcome back, family. My name is Jeremy Analo-Mensah. I'm with my co-host,
Eric Igwe,
with the Shot of E&J podcast. We want to continue our conversation about climate change. And now we want to sort of transition into talking about technological advancements and things that are coming in the future. So, Dr. Harvey, what are some technological advancements and current research that you are currently pursuing?
Yes, so it's, as I said, it's more a layered approach. So there's a series of research that's been going on. I've worked on some of this research like a decade ago. So typically I tell people that what you're seeing now was probably worked on a decade ago, right? So we can talk about the big guns at first. Let's talk about the big guns. And the big gun is direct CO2 capture, right? Which is, we know that there is excess CO2 in the atmosphere. How can we then take it out? Right? And then there's a challenge, right? Because even though CO2 is a major gas, believe it or not, it's a tiny fraction of the atmosphere. So when you take out air, it's way less than 1%. Wow. Put it that way. It's way. So the atmosphere is about 70% nitrogen and about 21% oxygen. Right, so that's already 90-something percent. CO2 is a tiny portion of the atmosphere. So when you remove air, then you have to separate the small CO2 component from all of that, which requires a lot of energy. So that's a big challenge there. There's been a lot of investment and a lot of focus around that from an engineering perspective, right? So then there's the other level. Well, if we know where the primary sources of CO2 is coming from, that is factories to make products, right? That is processing fossil fuel, etc. Then naturally we call those point sources. We know where they are, so we can go there and minimize the amount of CO2 from each point, right? So we can do that. So they're doing things like redesigning smokestacks, right? The stacks that you're who's from Houston.
I'm from
Houston.
Yeah.
I'm sure you're familiar with that, right?
Yeah.
When the vans, what happened there? There was a big project a few years back where we could actually take that CO2 and pump it back into the ground. We call that geologic carbon sequestration. So a lot of people don't know this, but there's research that shows that if we take all the CO2 we could generate in the next 145 years, there's space on the earth that we could store it. Yeah, the challenge is that it's really expensive
to do it.
Wow.
Right, to do that. And then what's the real value? So then there's geologic carbon sequestration. Then there's an addition to that, okay, if we put that CO2 down there, we could actually make it a product, right? So then it becomes geologic carbon storage utilization. Right, so that CO2. It's if you think of natural gas, right? We could actually, and we did some research on this a few years ago. We have microbes or microorganisms in the ground that chews on CO2. That's their food.
Gotcha.
And we can turn it back into, let's not say methane. Let's say natural gas.
Gotcha.
And so the bottleneck is that it's slower. It's slower than we typically can generate it. But if we can put the CO2 down, take it back out as natural gas, put it in a closed loop system, so still burn it, but it doesn't go to the atmosphere, and cycle it back again, right? There's a net zero emission.
So so it goes to the soil. You can prevent any damage or any impact to the land by making it into natural gas.
Well, it's not the soil. It's much deeper.
Okay.
It's in the reservoirs, right? In rocks where you get oil and gas from, essentially, right? Okay. So you're putting it back down there. You're transforming it.
Okay.
Right? I don't know if there are oil companies that are actually using that CO2 to flush excess oil out, but about 50% of that CO2 get trapped. So they're actually storing that CO2. And then when it comes back up with the oil, you have 50% still stored down there, and then they could separate the oil and put it back in, right? So that oil is actually, it's now referred to as net zero oil. Right?
Interesting.
The other thing is that you could sell that carbon credits to allow companies to defer. Right, to defer the amount of CO2, because that CO2 is stored, it's trapped long term or relatively long term. So that's another one, right? So that's geologic carbon sequestration, where we can we can take it out, we can geologic carbon sequestration, we could put it in the ground, we could utilize it, right? There's also other efforts to say, okay, CO2, like photosynthesis, right? We take CO2, we make it into glucose or whatever for as fuel. Well, we could actually take that CO2 and make it into what we call feedstocks to then make bigger fuels. Does that make sense? So we are utilizing that CO2. So there's a lot of fundamental research around if we put this CO2 through some process, right, then we can use it as a feedstock or a starting material for some other process, right, that would likely require a petroleum-based component, but now we don't, right, because we could make that initial component. So that's another utilization strategy.
Yeah. It's interesting that you mentioned that CO2, carbon dioxide, makes a small portion of the environment, but it has a lot more damaging effect on the environment. I think for some, it's so hard to process. Like you were saying, 70% oxygen, 1% nitrogen, and then CO2
the other way around.
More nitrogen.
70% nitrogen, 21% oxygen. And you said a small portion is carbon dioxide, but it makes that much of a damaging impact. Like it's
the effect of the gas. So remember, I told you that if you go in that greenhouse, it's hotter. So CO2 and those gases are very potent at preventing heat from going back to space. So it's a small amount relatively. Nitrogen doesn't have a greenhouse effect. That's what we call it.
Okay.
Right. However, it's prevalent. Oxygen is what we breathe, and I think
Yep.
it's more like actually 79% nitrogen. So I quoted that wrong. Right.
Okay.
So it's everything else makes up about 1% of everything.
Gotcha.
Good.
No, that's good to know.
Yeah.
Is it true that there's some research about how to trap carbon on vehicle tailpipes? Or am I wrong?
Yes.
Okay.
So,
I
how
read that
did you
somewhere. I'm like,
hear
what?
about that? well, we actually. So as I said, there's a ton. I did this with a high school student.
Mm-hmm.
We the same thing you're talking about. We did some work. I mentor high school students, and we did some work a couple of years ago before COVID with some two students from Harmony School of Innovation, Fort Worth, right? And they were interested in this. And so we designed an experiment to show that if we add enough calcium in water, right, or sodium, and we pump CO2 through it, you'll see white things falling out, right? Well, that's rock. That's calcium carbonate, which is then used to make building materials. Right, so that's another utilization step. Well, the next stage, and we never was to then design where if we attach something to a tailpipe, right, let's say where the catalytic converter is, and that gas goes through it and it cycles around, then we could make a replaceable thing that when we take it out, we have some sort of calcium carbonate without CO2 in it. Right, that never got anywhere on because the COVID came. I guess the students got older and they went different places. But there's a lot of things.
Okay, that's good to know.
There's
so that
a
could
lot of
potentially keep the carbon from going out. It just stays trapped in terms of. So as you drive, it will interesting.
Yes.
The carbon will.
Yes, and then you take it. The idea is that the material that's produced could be used as something else, right?
Wow.
So it's utilizing that carbon, that CO2. So and then you minimize the need to do other things.
That's impressive.
Yeah.
So now that brings into the question: what steps can elected officials do to help prevent climate change? Any policy recommendations you have? I mean, I know through the Congress, they've recently passed. I think the Inflation Act. Is definitely giving tax credits. It's a huge bill for climate change, and I think I don't know how much. I want to say $300 billion, but don't quote me. It's a lot of money that's thrown towards climate change efforts, renewing some tax credits. Is there other things that elected officials can do to help prevent climate change?
Yeah, I'm not political, so let me skew it another way. I think whatever elected officials do, it could go a long way in stimulating things, right? So I think you add on your thing about the California thing. And then the idea again, which is I would like to see it shift from climate change to environmental change for this particular reason as it concerns to politics. When I say climate, I'm talking about long-term stuff, right? Right. But when I say environment, I'm talking about direct things that we could see. A politician is in for 4 years, 6 years maximum. He could say, okay, I'm going to do something on he or she climate change. But what does that mean? You can't hold him to anything. He or she to anything. Right? Because it's a long-term thing. Right. However, if we start saying things, and they're doing good things, right? So don't get me wrong. I think if they put shorter term targets and then tie it to funding, right? And I think have you guys heard about the Justice 40?
No.
Justice 40, and so that's where I'm going to skew this argument to. I think particularly in underrepresented communities or minority communities, right? Minority communities don't get to participate in a lot of this because of economic reasons, right? How many people can afford solar cells? Right? How many people can afford new windows? Right? So the Justice 40, which is released by the Biden administration, by the way, is committing 40% of federal funding to these communities. right?
Wow.
I forget what they call them. There's a name for them. Now, what does that mean? What should those communities be doing? I don't want to say we living on the southwest side of Fort Worth, right? I want to talk about the east side of Fort Worth, right? When we get all these initiatives for green energy, how do those people participate? Right? How do we get those people to participate? Right? How do we get them incentives to say, okay, we know you can afford it, but let's go and maybe it's someone in the community that builds a business that would then make use of this federal funding to then support those people. Maybe we train people on those side I forgot the term that they used. I don't want to say disadvantage or something. I don't think that's the correct term they use, right? But it's things like this that I think is far more valuable than relying on elected officials to make decisions, right? I think it's what can we leverage from those positions to then get to the people. So I'm more interested in grassroots efforts. Right, grassroots efforts. Elected officials are important. I know on the southeast side of town, with the urban ag, I forgot this guy's name. I'm sorry, I'm not. But he has been supporting those efforts. Right. And so I'm not saying elected officials are not key. I think they have something in pushing things along and providing funding, but I think grassroots efforts is where it's at.
Gotcha.
Right? And instilling in the people that you have the power to change your situation, and then setting up a system to support them.
Yeah.
Right. So I think, and it's all about, it's climate related. Right. I like to see people develop businesses around. Go look it up. This Justice for the thing. I think if we can get it out, I know then there's the environmental justice and energy justice, right? So DOE and the Department of Energy, which actually funds a lot of my research, the U.S. Department of Energy and the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, they have what they now call the energy justice from the DOE and environmental justice from the EPA, right? And they are part of this bigger Justice 40 thing. So there's in essence, there's funding to support initiatives in these communities. And there's a map. It's a lot of it that's around here that's considered disadvantaged. Right? So those are, I think that's where it's at. Particularly, I have a passion for these kind of communities, right? Because I think we get left behind in that sense in developing a strong economic base around science. The other thing I'll say is I'll encourage parents, and this is no joke, to let their students get involved in science. I know I'm not negating the importance of social stuff, but at the economic foundation, right, it's the fundamental aspects of science that then creates these new technologies that solve these problems, right? That on the front, it may look like a social justice problem, and I'm not saying that that's not the case partially, but I think if we had the scientific grounding in a lot of these things, we can solve them as a community without relying. Right? So I think science, and particularly geology, I'm going to be biased.
No, I understand.
All right. So I think the last thing we kind of want to end on is, we talked about consequences, and we talked about, what happens when, climate change occurs and how that affects us. But where are we headed, in your opinion, if we don't start to make some of these changes and implement some of the things that we talked about today?
We're heading to a situation where those who can afford to move will move, right? But what about those who can't? Right, so I'm actually quoting a Jamaican, Bob Marley.
Yeah.
Bob Marley.
Right? But what about those who can't?
Yeah.
Right, and so I think that's where it is. If you have enough economic power to move, as I described to you in the break, I've seen it. Right, so I think it's that's where we're headed, and it's gonna be far more disastrous than what right. That's, as I said, I have a passion for equity, right? So in my science, in everything I do, I want to see equity, right? And so when I view this thing, I view this as another part of equity that we should be thinking about real deeply, right? And it's how do we educate people to build an economic base, right, through whatever skill sets they have. I prefer science and engineering. No, I think that's I come from a household where we know from the get-go that education is the way out, right? I like to see that more. That's my view of it, right? And so it's going to cause a broader divide between the haves and the have-not, right? Because soon it's basic. If you have only limited resources, right, what is going to happen, right? We talk about the rise in food costs. Well, what that's going to create is that you're in the same town, and on one side, some people have it lavishly, and on the other side, they can't afford it. They can't afford the food. So I think that's one of the consequences that we're going to see more of. And then that's going to bring unease, which then leads to war, right? You can't avoid those things. Right? And so I think it's just a big thing. I'm looking way beyond just the talk of.
Well, the reason why it's interesting you brought it up, because the other day I read a Time magazine article, talking about 2100. What happens, like, I don't know if you read that article, but it was a fascinating article.
No.
It was essentially saying, like, where we're headed, this country and this world's headed is like the Florida will become a place that people can no longer live because it'll be too hot for people to live. And they expect like areas like Michigan and Minnesota, going to Canada to be more desirable places, because as certain places start getting warmer, Florida will be too hot for people to live. And then they were saying Minnesota and Michigan will come to new Florida by 2100. And more people will be moving up there. And as the ice starts melting in Greenland, they'll start creating new communities, and that you have new cities built there. So about the haves and have-nots, like you're saying, the people who are not able to afford it, let's say we continue the same path, and Florida no longer is a place people live, for example, by 2100, and people have to move up north. Who has the resources to move up north and live in Minnesota or Michigan or Canada or Greenland as those communities start to get built? Because Greenland, as people know, has traditionally a lot of ice, right? It's not a place you can have a city, but now the ice is starting to melt, and if it continues as a rate, you're going to have a lot of open land that has never been built, and you'll create possibly new cities out of it, and it'll become a more desirable place because, even though it's warmer, it'll be like Florida, or, like Florida is today. It was just a very futuristic, fascinating article.
It's not even that futuristic, right? I mean, even now, you can a classic example is those big snakes in Florida. I forgot what they call them. But if you look on their territory, they're now moving further north, right? They use alligators, for instance. I was surprised to find out that alligators is at Fort Worth Nature Center thriving. We're used to alligators on the coast. Right? So you're having that kind of, you just have to look to see that it's not that futuristic. For you, it may be, right? Because it hasn't hit us yet. But if we look around in our environment, we start seeing changes that are open. California is suffering from more droughts because the snowpacks is shifting the way they're deposited, all those things. We're already seeing them, right? So, so it's heavy, right? It's and I like to tell people it's for us to really think about what we're seeing right here. Right? Oftentimes we respond only it's way out there, and we say, forget that.
Yeah.
We don't respond until it's
hits
right in our face,
Yeah.
right? And I think that's more reactive. Particularly, and again, I can't harp on this more, is people who are in minority communities.
Yeah.
Right? We have to reignite what we know we have in us, right? Because that has been killed for however long, right? We now get demotivated because of history. We have to learn to reignite that. We have to bring, for instance, I told you about that grant. I want to talk, if you don't mind, give me a couple of minutes. So that grant that we got from actually through the USDA, but it's administered through what we call a Southern SEER, which is Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education. Okay. We got one of the first urban agriculture grants to work out there in Southeast Fort Worth. And what we're doing out there is that we're looking at this food diversion thing that I mentioned, is diverting food, building up a community. So farmers could see that as a business, right? But not only that, they could not just as a food production business. That's important because it's a food desert. But beyond that, it's also that they're providing an ecosystem service or a series of services that have value. They're diverting carbon, so they're storing carbon that should be able to be sold on the market to generate money, right? They're using less resources, so because they're composting this and land applying it, they don't have to go buy fertilizer. That's a value, right? There's space being saved in the landfill. That's a value. We know that when you have high amounts of organic matter in soil, it reduces the amount of water that you need to use. That's a value, right? And so how do we then, rather than look at these farms as just food production, because if you as a developer come in on one of those properties, there's no way a farmer could produce enough peppers, onions, tomatoes to justify not getting that land developed, right? But now if we frame it, it's not only about food, but the fact that we're bringing all these other ecosystem services, and when you have greener areas, you have cooler cities, and so that reduce the energy bill, those kind of things. And what we're doing here, we have 2 positions on there for grad students, and we my colleagues and I made a deliberate effort to get grad students from that area, right? And our view is that if we build the capacity of those people, of the people that live there, then it will reside there, right? And then it will build from there. So it's those kind of things we want to do. So we have started, we've hired one person. We're looking for another one, right? Another student, another grad student to work on, and it goes on till 2025. So we'll get that student trained in all the fancy technologies. Right? We're using drones, we're using high-tech equipment out there. We're bringing what we call precision ag. So if you look on how they farm these thousands of acre farms with all those GPSs and all those things, we're bringing that to the small farmers to say, hey, you can do this, you can manage your resources, you could use this technology to make decisions that make your business profitable while meeting a need. Right? And so that's climate change too.
Wow.
There you go.
There you go.
It fits in that picture.
No, that's fascinating. No, I appreciate you sharing that, and definitely got to check it out and do some research on
cutting edge.
No, it is. Well, we're gonna end with our call of action. We want to, normally give our call of action back to the audience on this. Jeremy, you want to go get started?
Yeah. So, in taking everything today and what has been talked about and discussed, I think I'm going to steal yours, Dr. Harvey. The system. I love that. So my call to action to the people would be understand the system and utilize the system, find your place in the system so that we can all play our part to prevent environmental change. I think it's very profound because in politics, we talk about politics a lot as well. We often think about how the different levels of the political system at the city level, the state level, the federal level, how it all works together. And so I think this is yet another area where people have to understand that, like you know, what we said in the beginning, it's not just about weather, right?
Yes.
There's so much more to climate change and environmental change. And so I think understanding that is key. And that's what I would call people to do more to understand environmental change and how the things, you know, around them can affect and what they can do in order to affect the change.
Yeah. For me, my call to action is just making sure we link environmental change to consequences. Like you mentioned, too many times we're in our own space. People working to get a job. You know, we're working. We are, doing a 9 to 5, 8 to 5. We're just so consumed with us and family and so many things going on. And then you hear about climate change. Like you said, it's not in front of me. So I'm gonna keep focused and keep moving. But it's more of a push to even some of the scientists and some of the experts to continue to tie the effects of environment change to events, right? Mm-hmm. And maybe even break it down to a city level. Like if I'm living in, like I said, I'm living in Fort Worth, let me know what the possible effects could be in Fort Worth. Maybe certain aspects of Fort Worth. We know there's certain places in Fort Worth or certain cities that are more susceptible to those environmental changes, environmental change. So having that information shared, dispersed more often, but tying into events so we can, everyday individuals can feel the impacts. Say, okay, wow, like I'm seeing the changes. I see what you're talking about. I can see this part of the city that's going to continue to feel those impacts, but tying into consequences because people better understand that than people like, yeah, this is going to happen. And you're like, all right, whatever. And then it hits you and it's too late. And like I said, it becomes the haves and have-nots, like you mentioned, where certain people are able to move into those more desirable places and others may not have those opportunities. So,
yeah. For me, I would say for the parents and to young people, right? My view of it is that nothing good comes easy, right? So we will have to, as I always explain to my student, there's a reason why it's called extraordinary, right? You want to be more than ordinary. So don't just go to school to get a degree.
Yeah.
Don't just go to school to pass an exam. That's important. I'm not saying that. But you got to think about what is my value here on earth, right? What is my value here? It can't just be that you just come to live and go, right? You have to leave some legacy. And so I'll encourage them. That extra means something. Mm-hmm. You have to go that extra mile, right? You have to spend that extra minute. You just have to do it. You weren't made to be simple, right? And so don't run away from the art science classes. Rise to the occasion. Right? I'm going to be biased again because I think geology allows us to have that great integration of all these sciences and even the social components too. I think geology allows you to utilize your biology, your chemistry, your math, your physics, your geology of itself, the social implications of those things. So I think go do extraordinary things. I think that's it for the parents and for young people. Good. I think that's my call.
Great.
All right. Well, I think that does it. Yeah. We want to thank everybody for watching today. This was a wonderful conversation that we had about environmental change. Stay tuned for what we got next. Signing off.
Sign off.